The Forgotten Study Tour. Set at State University of New York. Step 1, The Discovery. It was supposed to be a simple academic field trip. The group of 7 students from the anthropology department at the State University of New York had been chosen to participate in a week-long study tour. Their destination was an old, secluded campus building, long abandoned and scheduled for demolition. The building had been part of a now-defunct archaeology department that had mysteriously shut down in the late 1980s. Dr. Alan Meyer, the professor leading the tour, had spoken excitedly about the history of the building. It had been used to store thousands of rare artifacts unearthed from sites across the state. But what intrigued the students most was the rumored, the dark, unspoken secret that something had happened there decades ago. Something that no one could explain. The building, covered in ivy and showing signs of neglect, stood at the far end of campus, away from the newer, more populated areas. The students, Mark, Jenna, Luis, Brian, Casey, Taylor, and Rachel, arrived early on a chilly October morning. They all felt a strange sense of unease as they stood before the imposing structure, its tall windows dark and lifeless. Dr. Meyer was late, but the group decided to explore the building on their own. The old front door creaked open with little resistance, as if the building had been expecting them. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of mildew. The students shuffled through the main hall, their footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. The building was larger than they'd anticipated, with long, narrow hallways and countless doors leading to forgotten offices and storage rooms. Jenna, the most curious of the group, wandered ahead of the others. She opened a door marked Archives and called for the others to follow her. Inside, they found rows of shelves filled with ancient books and boxes of documents. But it was the display case in the corner that caught their attention. Encased in glass was an artifact unlike any they had ever seen before, a small stone figurine, carved in the shape of a grotesque figure, its hollow eyes staring out as if it could see them. "What is that thing?" Luis asked, his voice tinged with unease. "It looks ancient," Mark said, stepping closer to examine it. "Maybe it's from one of the dig sites?" Brian chuckled nervously. "Probably cursed or something." "Come on, Brian," Jenna replied, rolling her eyes. "Don't start with that." But as they stood there, staring at the figurine, the room seemed to grow colder. The air became heavy, and a faint whispering sound filled the space around them. At first, they thought it was the wind, but the whispers grew louder, more distinct, like voices speaking just out of reach. "What the hell is that?" Taylor asked, looking around the room. "It's just the wind," Mark said, though his voice wavered. But Rachel wasn't so sure. She had been feeling uneasy since they stepped inside the building, and now she felt a growing sense of dread. Her eyes darted to the artifact, then to the shadows in the corners of the room. "I don't like this," she said quietly. Before anyone could respond, the door to the archive room slammed shut with a deafening bang. The group jumped, startled, as the whispers grew louder, filling their heads with disjointed words and phrases they couldn't understand. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The room was silent again, save for the rapid breathing of the students. "We need to leave," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "Something's wrong here." Mark tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. "It's locked." "Impossible," Casey said, joining him at the door. "It wasn't locked before." Panic began to set in as they realized they were trapped. Step 2, the haunting begins. The next few hours were a blur. Dr. Meyer still hadn't arrived, and the students had given up trying to force the door open. They decided to search for another exit, but the deeper they ventured into the building, the stranger things became. Luis swore he saw movement in one of the dusty hallways, just a shadow, fleeting, but enough to make him stop in his tracks. Jenna found old journals in one of the offices, detailing strange, undocumented rituals that had taken place in the building before it was shut down. Taylor complained of hearing a woman's voice calling her name, though no one else heard it. And then there was the cold. It followed them everywhere, seeping through the walls, chilling them to the bone. No matter how many layers they wore or how tightly they huddled together, the cold wouldn't leave them. By the third day, the group was desperate to get out. The whispers had returned, sometimes soft and indistinct, other times loud and insistent. But the worst part was the dreams. Every night, they all dreamed of the same thing, the stone figurine, its hollow eyes staring into their souls, and the same phrase, repeated over and over in a language none of them could understand. "We shouldn't have touched that thing," Brian muttered one night as they huddled together in one of the classrooms. "It's cursed. I told you." "We didn't touch it," Jenna snapped, though the fear in her voice was evident. "It's just, this place is old. It's probably just our minds playing tricks on us." But Rachel shook her head. "No. This isn't just our imagination. There's something here. Something evil." As if in response to her words, the lights flickered, and the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway outside the door. Slow, deliberate footsteps, growing closer with each passing second. Mark stood up, grabbing a flashlight. "Stay here. I'm going to see who it is." "Don't," Rachel pleaded. "We should stay together." But Mark ignored her, stepping out into the hallway. The light from his flashlight wavered as he turned the corner, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then they heard it, a blood-curdling scream, followed by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. Louise and Brian rushed into the hallway, their hearts pounding in their chests. But when they turned the corner, Mark was gone. The only thing left was his flashlight, rolling on the floor, its beam casting long shadows along the walls. Step 3, the confrontation. The remaining 6 students were frantic. Mark's disappearance had shaken them all, and they knew they were no longer alone in the building. Something was hunting them, something connected to the cursed figurine in the archives. Rachel was the first to suggest it, the artifact had to be returned. Whatever had been released when they found it, whatever malevolent force had been unleashed, it needed to be sealed away again. But to do that, they had to go back to the archive room. No one wanted to go back. The whispers, the cold, the feeling of being watched, it was all worse near that room. But with no other choice, they agreed to make the journey together. The building seemed to fight them every step of the way. The walls groaned as they passed, doors that had been open before were now locked, and the cold grew more intense, making it harder to breathe. The whispers became louder, more aggressive, as if the spirits were taunting them. Finally, they reached the archive room. The stone figurine was still there, its hollow eyes staring out from behind the glass. Rachel took a deep breath and stepped forward, reaching out to open the display case. The second her hand touched the glass, the room erupted in chaos. The lights flickered violently, casting strange shadows across the walls. The whispers became screams, shrill and deafening. And from the darkness, figures began to emerge, shapeless, ghostly forms that surrounded the group, their hollow eyes glowing with malevolent intent. "Do it, Rachel!" Louise shouted over the cacophony. "We don't have much time." Rachel grabbed the figurine, her hands shaking as she lifted it from its pedestal. The moment she did, the shadows surged forward, their twisted forms reaching for the students, their hands cold and skeletal. Rachel could feel the darkness closing in around her, could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on her chest. But she knew what she had to do. With one last, desperate effort, she slammed the figurine down onto the floor. The stone shattered, and with it, the shadows recoiled, screaming in fury as they dissolved into the air. The cold lifted, the whispers faded, and the room fell silent once more. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the faint dripping of water from a crack in the ceiling. Finally, Rachel let out a shaky breath. "Is it over?" The others nodded, too stunned to speak. But as they turned to leave, they didn't notice the small piece of the figurine still lying on the floor, untouched by the destruction. Its hollow eyes glimmered in the dim light, watching them as they disappeared down the hallway. The end. Story 2. The Last Night in the Hall. Part 1, The Unseen Presence. Emma had always heard the stories about Northwood Hall, the oldest dormitory on campus. Rumors whispered in hushed voices, passed between students over late-night study sessions, told of the strange occurrences that happened after midnight. Most dismissed them as urban legends, a way to scare freshmen. But now, sitting alone in her dimly lit room on the last night before winter break, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that there was some truth to the tales. The hall was eerily quiet. Everyone else had already left for the holidays, and Emma was the last to pack her things. She had a late exam, and by the time she finished, most of the other students had cleared out. Her roommates, Amanda and Lily, had left that afternoon, and she hadn't realized how unsettling it would feel to be completely alone in the vast, empty building. As she zipped up her suitcase, the oppressive silence pressed down on her. No voices in the hallway, no doors slamming, no faint laughter drifting through the walls. Just the low hum of the ancient heating system and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors. Emma glanced at the clock, 11:45 p.m. Her taxi to the airport wouldn't arrive until 1 a.m. She had about an hour to kill, so she decided to shower and change into comfortable clothes for the long journey home. The communal bathrooms were located down the hall, past several rooms that stood dark and deserted. The dim, flickering lights overhead cast long shadows on the walls, making the hallway seem endless. As Emma reached the bathroom door, she thought she heard something, a faint, distant sound, like soft footsteps. She froze, her hand hovering over the doorknob, listening. But there was nothing. Only silence. She shook her head, scolding herself for being so jumpy. After all, she was alone in the building. Who else could be there? Emma opened the door and stepped into the bathroom. The light was harsh and fluorescent, flickering slightly, adding to her unease. She quickly undressed and stepped into the shower, letting the warm water wash away the tension that had been building in her shoulders. But the sense of unease didn't leave her. In fact, it grew worse. As the water poured over her, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She kept glancing over her shoulder, expecting to see something, standing behind her. But the bathroom was empty. She forced herself to relax, telling herself it was just nerves. She was alone, and in just a couple of hours, she'd be on a plane, far away from this creepy, old building. But then, just as she was about to turn off the water, she heard it again, footsteps. This time, much closer. Slow, deliberate steps, just outside the bathroom door. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned off the water, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped. "Hello," she called out, her voice shaky. "Is someone there?" No response. Only silence. Emma quickly grabbed her towel and wrapped it around herself, her hands trembling. She opened the bathroom door slowly, peeking into the hallway. It was empty. The long corridor stretched out in both directions, dimly lit and utterly still. She hurried back to her room, locking the door behind her. Her heart was racing, and she could feel the panic rising in her chest. "It's nothing," she told herself. "Just my imagination." But deep down, she knew something was wrong. The air in the hall felt heavy, like she wasn't as alone as she thought. She dressed quickly, deciding to wait by the front door until her taxi arrived. But as she was about to leave her room, a sound stopped her dead in her tracks, a faint knock at the door. Tap. 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 It was gentle, almost polite, but in the empty building, it sent chills down her spine. "Who's there?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. No answer. Her pulse quickened as she stared at the door. The knock came again, louder this time. Tap. 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 Emma's hand shook as she reached for the doorknob. She hesitated for a long moment before slowly turning it and opening the door. The hallway was empty. Part 2: The Truth Behind the Door. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She looked left, then right, nothing. The hallway was completely still, as if no one had ever knocked. But she knew she had heard it. The knocking had been real. A wave of nausea washed over her as the dread in her chest deepened. She stepped out into the hallway, half expecting someone to jump out from the shadows, but there was nothing, just the same flickering lights and the distant hum of the heating system. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, and her mouth felt dry. "I'm leaving," she muttered to herself, walking back into her room to grab her bag. But as she turned, she noticed something out of place. The door to the room next to hers, room 312, was slightly ajar. She knew for a fact that all the rooms had been closed and locked earlier in the day. Room 312 belonged to a student named Sophie, who had left 2 days ago. A cold shiver ran down Emma's spine as she stared at the door. It looked so ordinary, but something about it felt wrong. She tried to brush off the growing fear gnawing at her mind, but her curiosity got the better of her. Against her better judgment, she took a step closer. The hallway felt even colder now, as though the very air was watching her. Her hands trembled as she reached for the door, pushing it open slowly. The room was dark, but not entirely. A faint light flickered inside, like a dying candle. The air smelled stale, and the walls seemed to close in around her as she stepped inside. "Sophie?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. "Is anyone here?" There was no response, only the oppressive silence. But then, from the corner of the room, she saw something, movement. A shape, dark and shadowy, stood near the bed, barely visible in the faint light. Emma froze, her breath caught in her throat. The shape shifted, almost imperceptibly, and then the light in the room flickered once, twice, and went out completely. Panic surged through her, and she stumbled backward, scrambling for the door. But just as she reached it, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping her inside. Her breathing came in short, panicked gasps as she fumbled in the darkness, her hands searching for the doorknob. But the room had changed. It felt different, larger, colder, as if the walls had disappeared, leaving her standing in an endless void. And then she heard it, soft, slow breathing, coming from directly behind her. Emma's entire body tensed. She didn't dare turn around, but the presence was undeniable. Someone, or something, was standing right behind her, so close she could feel the icy breath on the back of her neck. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Her body was paralyzed with fear. Then, a voice, soft and whispering, filled the room. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was cold, devoid of emotion, and it sent a shiver down Emma's spine. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying it would go away, praying she would wake up and realize it had all been a nightmare. But the cold breath persisted, and the presence behind her grew stronger, closer. And then, in the darkness, a hand, cold and clammy, grazed her shoulder. Emma screamed. She bolted for the door, her hand finally finding the doorknob. She twisted it, throwing herself out into the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't stop to look back. She ran down the hallway, her footsteps echoing in the silent building. The walls seemed to stretch and twist around her, the doors all blending together into an endless maze. She could hear the whispers now, louder, surrounding her from all sides. Finally, she reached the front door. She burst through it, gasping for breath as she stumbled out into the cold night air. Her taxi was waiting, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Without a second thought, she threw her bags into the car and climbed inside. As the taxi pulled away from Northwood Hall, Emma glanced back at the building one last time. And there, standing in the window of room 312, was a figure watching her leave. The end. Story 3. The Roommate. When I first moved into the dorms at Westbrook Hall, I couldn't have been more excited. It was my second semester, and I was finally getting out of the overcrowded temporary housing. My new roommate, Dan, seemed like a quiet guy, polite, if a little distant. I figured we'd get along just fine. But over time, things began to feel off. At first, it was small things. Dan didn't seem to have a consistent schedule. Some nights, he'd be in bed when I got back from class, lying perfectly still, as though he hadn't moved for hours. Other times, I wouldn't see him for days, and when I asked where he'd been, he'd just smile vaguely and say, "Around." It was strange, but I chalked it up to the usual quirks of college life. But then, other things started happening. Subtle, unsettling things. I'd hear him in the middle of the night, moving around when I knew he should have been asleep. The sounds were always soft, like shuffling, or the creak of footsteps on the old wooden floor, but they unnerved me. Whenever I asked about it in the morning, he'd just stare at me blankly, as if he didn't know what I was talking about. It was about 3 weeks into the semester when I started noticing his eyes. They were always a little too wide, a little too still. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at me while I was at my desk, his face expressionless. He'd quickly look away when I noticed, but the moments stretched on longer than they should have. And there was something about the way he blinked, like it was an afterthought, something he'd forgotten to do. It made my skin crawl. But the strangest thing was that Dan never seemed to eat. Not in front of me, at least. I'd come back to the room with takeout, and he'd always say he wasn't hungry. His side of the mini fridge was always empty, and I never saw him go to the dining hall. It struck me as odd, but I didn't push it. We weren't close enough for me to question his habits. Then, one night, everything changed. It was late, probably around 2 a.m., and I had fallen asleep with my laptop still open on my lap. I woke up suddenly, with the uncomfortable feeling that someone was watching me. The room was pitch black, except for the dim glow of my laptop screen. I shifted in bed, trying to shake the uneasy sensation, and that's when I saw him. Dan was standing at the foot of my bed. He wasn't moving. He wasn't saying anything. Just standing there, his pale face barely visible in the darkness, eyes wide and unblinking. Dan? My voice trembled, sleep still fogging my mind. What are you doing? No answer. He didn't even flinch. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. Dan? He slowly tilted his head to the side, like he was studying me. The way he moved, it wasn't natural. It was slow, deliberate, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. For a few long moments, he just stood there, staring at me, and I swear I could hear his breath, shallow and raspy. Then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the room. I sat there, frozen, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. After a few minutes, I got up, opened the door, and looked down the hallway. It was empty. No sign of him. My heart was still racing, but I convinced myself it was a bad dream. That's all. I locked the door and went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily that night. The next morning, Dan acted like nothing had happened. He was his usual, quiet self, but something had shifted. His presence in the room felt heavier, more ominous. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me, even when my back was turned. That day, I bumped into one of the RAs, Claire, a girl who had been living in Westbrook for years. I mentioned Dan to her in passing, expecting some generic response, but her face went pale. Dan, she repeated, her voice hushed. Are you sure? I nodded, confused. Yeah, my roommate. Why? Claire hesitated, glancing around as though she was afraid someone might overhear. There used to be a guy named Dan who lived in your room. But, he died. A couple of years ago. There was an accident, right off campus. The world seemed to spin beneath me. What are you talking about? She nodded gravely. He was hit by a car late one night, coming back from a party. It was a freak accident. He died instantly. But I'm telling you, he lived in your room. There's no way you're living with him now. That's impossible. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. This had to be some kind of sick joke. But he's here, I said, my voice shaking. I've been living with him for weeks. Claire just stared at me, her expression unreadable. I don't know what's going on, she said finally. But you need to be careful. Sometimes the past lingers in this place. I didn't want to believe her, but after that conversation, I started noticing even more strange things. Dan would disappear for hours, only to reappear in the room without a sound. I'd catch glimpses of him in the mirror, just standing in the background, watching me. His behavior became more erratic. Sometimes he'd sit on his bed, staring at the wall for hours on end, not moving, not speaking. I tried to confront him once, but when I did, his face twisted into something cold and unrecognizable. He stood there, his body unnaturally still, and I realized with horror that his chest wasn't moving. He wasn't breathing. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. Dan? I whispered, but the thing standing before me wasn't Dan anymore. It was something else. Something wrong. That night, I packed my things and left the dorm without saying a word. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, and I didn't look back. To this day, I don't know what I was living with. But every now and then, I hear footsteps behind me, soft and deliberate, like someone is still watching. The end.